I'm Professor Lori Hodrick, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second annual Program for Financial Studies Conference. I am so thankful that you are safe and have successfully braved the aftermath of what I've been calling the Frankenstorm to be here today. Today we gather to discuss turning around governments, companies, and attitudes in a climate characterized by contentious political debate and conflict between governments, industries, and individuals. The timing of this debate in advance of next Tuesday's presidential election couldn't be more opportune. The program agenda will proceed as follows. We begin with our keynote address by Henry Miller, followed by two concurrent panels. Panel 1 will discuss asset management and will be held in this room. Panel 2 will discuss corporate finance and will be held in the Sato room, which is also on the 5th floor. Information about the panelists is available in your programs, and your name tag indicates which panel you have selected. After the panel, current Columbia Business School student attendees will join panelists for a luncheon on the 2nd floor. Both panels, as well as the keynote address, are being videotaped and will be posted on our website. So if you're interested in experiencing the other panel as well, or if you'd like to share your experience today with others, you'll be able to access those videos online. And especially given the difficulties of travel today, we're so delighted that that content will be available to everyone. Finally, let me gratefully acknowledge BNP Paribas for providing sponsorship of this event, as well as for our No Free Lunch seminar series. It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Henry S. Miller, a 1970 graduate of Columbia Business School and a member of the school's Board of Overseers. Over the course of his career, Mr. Miller has represented debtors, creditors, and other constituents in numerous out-of-court and Chapter 11 matters. These have included extremely complex reorganizations where the services provided involved raising rescue financing, strategic assignments, and divestiture of substantial assets or businesses of the affected enterprise. During his career, Mr. Miller has been a partner at Lehman Brothers, heading the private finance group in corporate finance, has served the chief financial officer at Eichner Properties, and has co-headed investment banking and headed the financial restructuring group at Prudential Securities. Mr. Miller then headed both the restructuring and transportation industry groups of Salomon Brothers, then served as vice chairman and the global head of the firm's financial restructuring group at Dresner. In 2002, Mr. Miller co-founded Miller Buckfire Company, where he was CEO until 2009, and chairman and managing director until his retirement in 2011. He has served as chairman of Marblegate Asset Management since its foundation in 2009. Mr. Miller is a trustee of Save the Children, of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Fordham University, which is his undergraduate alma mater. In addition, he serves on the boards of directors of AIG and Ally Financial. Our conference today explores turning around governments, companies, and attitudes. Certainly, it is a tremendous privilege to gain insights from a recent inductee into the Turnaround Management Association Hall of Fame, who has witnessed the past few years of challenges close up. And so, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce my carpool mate this morning, Henry Miller.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you for the kind introduction. I feel like we're living that new television show Revolution when the global power went out. For those of you who live out of town and who have successfully gotten here, congratulations. It's not been easy or fun. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to speak on the subject of turning around governments, companies, and attitudes. To quote Will Rogers, I don't make jokes, I just watch the government and report the facts. As Lori mentioned, I've spent over 25 of my 40-year finance career in corporate restructuring. Airlines, consumer goods companies, auto parts manufacturers, retailers, just to mention a few industries. Names like Kmart, Polaroid, TWA, Dana, and Interstate Bakeries, you know them for Wonder Bread, Twinkies, and Devil Dogs. And they will survive the revolution. The Twinkies will certainly. The heart of my work has been to take enterprises that were failing and rehabilitate them. Give them a second, sometimes a third chance. A restructuring firm is called in when the problems facing an organization or business, whether it's declining revenue and cash flow, the inability of management and labor to agree on terms that allow the business to function profitably, or excessive leverage that cannot be repaid or financed, faces a crisis. The purpose of my talk today will be to apply principles of corporate restructuring to the question of turning around governments, particularly in response to the extraordinary debt held at federal, state, and local levels. All this is further complicated by what is essentially good news, namely the incredible advances in medical technology and the ramifications of these advances on our debt problem. It's even more urgent and serious than you thought. There are 3 basic steps that are essential to a successful restructuring. Number 1, face the facts. There are many restructuring-isms, one being that denial is not just a river in Egypt. The first rule of restructuring is we are where we are. Blaming the prior CEO or board may feel good, but rarely achieves a workable solution. When I'm called in to restructure a company, the first step is to assess as accurately as possible the company's problems, and fast. The second step is to develop a new business plan, as the existing one obviously has flaws or flat out doesn't work. In formulating a plan, there are a number of factors that have to be taken into account. Have markets or consumer preferences changed? What are competitors doing differently? Are there new laws or regulations that are affecting the industry? Is management incompetent? Have the books been cooked? Are the problems temporary or long-term? Is there a simple fix, or does the situation require a comprehensive solution? The new business plan must address core problems and deficiencies. Many of the companies I restructured had operations that were fundamentally unsound. Information technology and control systems that were outdated or slow and inaccurate, making timely adjustments to problems impossible. Cost structures that were not competitive. Inflexible labor work rules. Outmoded products. These shortcomings may be addressed by shedding lines of business, selling non-core assets, negotiating concessions from unions, landlords, and creditors, moving production to less costly locations, reducing debt, finding new investors, bringing in new management. This plan has to be realistic and achievable. The assumptions underlying the plan rational, and the process employed to develop this new plan transparent and open to the review of all key stakeholders. All of this is to remake the organization for the future as a viable business for its stakeholders. That leads me to the third step, the restructuring itself. If you view the first 2 steps as redefining the pie, step 3 involves determining how the pie is divided and shared. Needless to say, this is a complex, often confrontational process. Restructuring, if you know anything about it, is full contact finance and will likely require painful concessions from equity owners, shareholders, creditors, management, and employees. The parties must be persuaded that short-term disruptions, uncertainty, and pain are necessary for the company to recover and succeed over a longer term. The medical analogy is frostbite, cutting off extremities to save vital organs. A critical element here is making sure the outcome is successful so that another round of painful measures is not necessary. This is particularly true for unionized labor. Getting agreement on concessions from the rank and file is very hard. Having to go back a second time is almost suicidal. Also, as you might imagine, when the parties set about revisiting the original contracts, the question of who was promised what and when has tremendous bearing on each stakeholder's disposition toward a prospective deal. Fear and greed are the two factors that underlie every restructuring. The stakeholder's main objective is often to determine what weaknesses on the other side can be manipulated to bring it to the bargaining table. This is called the has, wants, fears analysis. As a simplified example, secured lenders have a pledge of assets as collateral, want to receive principal interest and a speedy resolution of the case, and fear a degradation of asset and enterprise value, extensive delays, costs, and a write-down of their loan. We've now arrived at the point where we pose the question, how does one apply these corporate restructuring principles to our governments? Or to go along with the theme of this year's conference, what are the attitudes that policymakers must adopt in order to craft solutions to some of our government's financial difficulties and avoid a politically, financially, and socially devastating outcome? Let's go back to the corporate restructuring playbook. Face the facts. The debt problem at all levels of government has been growing for decades. According to the most recent Medicare Trustees report, the program faces an unfunded liability of almost $39 trillion. Social Security, around $9 trillion. For state and local government pensions, estimates vary, but the unfunded liability could be as high as $3 trillion. Charlie knows. I'm sure you know the answer. And if you consider commitments like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid to be comparable to funded debt, the federal debt to GDP well exceeds 100%. One of the lesser-known facts to most people is that the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, in scoring proposed legislation, uses a 10-year horizon to cost programs, for example, Obamacare. This is an entitlement, like Social Security or Medicare, that was meant to last decades. As a consequence, what we got was the equivalent of a 10-year interest-only teaser rate on a 30-year ARM. On the 10th year plus 1 day, the whole calculation will change, potentially costing many multiples of the price sold to the public at the time of the law's passage. Lest you were not already nervous, the positive news of rapidly advancing medical technology should do the trick. When LBJ signed Medicare into law in 1965, medicine was emerging victorious in the war against infectious diseases. For the past several decades, in the industrialized world, viruses and bacteria have ceased to be the main causes of physical impairment. Today, the major health problems tend to arise in people's genetic makeup. Certain individuals are, by nature, more susceptible to cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and high cholesterol than others. These kinds of conditions, which can call for different treatments depending on the individual patient, are becoming the primary occupations of doctors. And modern science is making astonishing inroads on this front. With the mapping of the human genome and the breakthroughs that have followed, scientists are poised to usher in a new era of individualized, personalized medicine. And we're already seeing it happen. All of this means that people are living not only longer, but better, well into what was considered old age. You may have seen articles proclaiming that 60 is the new 40, which for me at least was very nice to learn, life expectancies into the mid-80s or higher, in my opinion, will shock our society. Most people will say that all of this is good news. The bad news, however, is that our entitlement programs, state and local benefit programs, and even arguably our approach to the whole concept of retirement are not suited to the reality of people living as long as they are. At the same time, fertility rates have declined significantly, meaning fewer new workers paying into the retirement pot, while the political power of public sector unions and senior citizens have sustained benefits at increasingly generous levels, meaning more people taking out over a longer period than was ever planned for. In addition, one of the facts we ought to face is the outlook for economic growth. This is particularly critical in thinking about pension benefits at the state and local levels. As the members of this audience know well, the solvency of a pension plan can vary dramatically depending on the discount rate applied to both actuarial payout obligations and earnings on invested funds. Those who tend to favor the status quo, keep public pensions the way they are, often assume investment returns that may have been achieved in the past but might not likely in the future, as well as mortality rates lower than now is the case. That is, people will live longer. Those of you who follow developments in state fiscal policy may recall that a year ago, Rhode Island enacted a very aggressive piece of pension reform legislation. But interestingly enough, the architect of the plan, the state treasurer, who was a Democrat, by the way, said that the most acrimonious battle she had was over lowering the assumed discount rate. Get ready, 75 basis points, from 8.25% to 7.5% on invested funds. The state treasurer showed outstanding leadership in advancing these reforms. But for many actors whose horizons do not go beyond the next election, and this includes state legislators as well as union leaders, it remains a very powerful temptation to assume a high discount rate. Connecticut assumes an 8.25% rate today and is reluctantly moving to 8%. Mayor Bloomberg recently described a similar move in New York State as going from the, quote, absolutely hysterical, unquote, to the merely, quote, totally indefensible, unquote. In Connecticut, moving to a more rational 4.5% discount rate, which incidentally is in the range required by the US government for private sector companies, raises Connecticut's retirement obligations to $60 billion, $20 billion more than Connecticut reports today. So this leads me to the second step, the new business plan. As the military would say, this is not a drill. Although governments often have more funding options than private business, from taxing authority to issuing bonds to printing money, the capacity isn't infinite. As cities like Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Stockton, California, and others have discovered. And formerly AAA sovereigns like Spain and Italy lost their access to public capital markets and/or were forced to pay substantially higher interest rates to borrow or roll over maturing loans. To paraphrase Liza Doolittle, the pain from Spain could hit the States again. What is needed is a strategy that responds to these core problems. My own experience, I think, is particularly germane to developing a new business plan for state and local governments. In certain respects, this is of greater urgency than reforming federal entitlements, as critical as that is. States and municipalities have much less flexibility and ability to run annual deficits. Thus, with the rapidly escalating cost of public sector retirement benefits, we are now witnessing a dangerous crowding out of spending on vital public services. Cities are having to cut back on their active police and fire departments. Necessary infrastructure projects do not get off the ground. Nursing homes and senior centers, which serve some of our most vulnerable citizens, are also in financial straits. Some cities, such as Stockton, California, and Central Falls, Rhode Island, have been forced to declare bankruptcy. A plan for restructuring local governments to respond to the facts on the ground, so to speak, must revise significantly the open-ended promises made to public sector retirees. Given the demographic realities we face, increased longevity brought about by advances in medicine, combined with the decline in working population relative to retirees, benefits should not start at the young ages they often do. The average age for a public school teacher in America today, average retirement age, is 59. MTA workers in New York City can retire with full benefits at age 55 after 25 years on the job. New York City police officers and firefighters hired today will be able to retire with benefits after 22 years of service, regardless of age. I have the greatest respect and admiration for the public servants who keep us safe. But the ability to retire in one's 40s and collect benefits into one's 80s and 90s will continue to drive our states and local governments toward insolvency. This is especially true where employees contribute modestly or not at all. The benefits are constitutionally protected by the state, and the government entity, for example, New York City, is obligated to fund shortfalls in fund investment returns below a relatively high number, like 8%. Along with pensions, another open-ended promise in need of revision, though perhaps well known, is OPEB, other post-employment benefits. Many public employees keep state-funded health insurance until they become eligible for Medicare, and even then have the supplemental policy paid for by the state or municipality. In New York alone, OPEB constitutes a $250 billion unfunded liability. Considering the government's OPEB liability, I thought about the restructuring of a Tier 1 auto supplier called Dana Corp of Toledo, Ohio. That company, which had promised health care benefits to retirees, faced an OPEB balance sheet liability of $1.4 billion, an annual cost of $150 million. What we did was negotiate an agreement between the company and its unions in which the company created a health care trust called a Voluntary Employee Beneficiary Association, or VEBA, to be managed by the union for the benefit of its unionized retirees. Dana funded the trust with $800 million of cash and securities, approximately the equity value of the annual cost savings. In exchange for setting up the trust, the company was no longer liable for its workers' post-retirement health care. Approaches such as this one can be a useful benchmark for policymakers to design a new plan to deal with its unfunded health care promises. While politicians often advocate raising local property, sales, or income taxes, this should not be part of a business plan that does not also involve structural reforms to open-ended promises. Last year, Illinois raised taxes, but did not address its underlying problems. While the state raised an additional $7 billion in revenues, it's right back where it started. Tellingly, Caterpillar, the construction and mining equipment manufacturer based in Peoria, announced in February that it would not consider Illinois as a location for a new plan. The company cited, quote, concerns about the business climate and overall fiscal health of the state of Illinois, unquote, as one of its reasons. As George Bernard Shaw once said, quote, a government which robs Peter to pay Paul can always depend on the support of Paul. He didn't add, probably not from Peter. And as we are seeing, Peter may decide to move away. To really make our governments run more efficiently and at lower cost, here are a few suggestions for that new business plan. One, at the state and local level, merge smaller towns to eliminate the duplication of administration, fire, public security, and education. Eliminate county government in many places. These are remnants from revolutionary times. You just have to live in Westchester to understand this. At the federal level, mandate a top-to-bottom review of the government at least every 10 years. As times and the world change, do we really need the same cabinet departments, agencies, bureaus as existed 10, 20, 30, 50, or 100 years ago? We can retrain displaced workers and move them to jobs where they can be relevant. 3, freeze pensions for public employees. Lower or eliminate cost of living adjustments for existing employees and retirees. That alone is a 10% difference in the unfunded liability. New employees can only be offered, and existing employees whose pensions have been frozen have to convert to 401k style deferred contribution retirement plans. No more defined benefit plans. Number 5, we have to increase the retirement age. Start paying pensions at age 65, not from retirement date. 6, make notes and bonds issued to meet pension funding shortfalls tax exempt to boost their plan viability and reduce funding costs. 7, transfer OPEB to unions with a large upfront cash payment so that unions are required to deal with their own workers to eliminate $1 coverage and to develop better and lower healthcare cost delivery systems. All beneficiaries must have skin in the game. Mechanically, I think the plan would be implemented and funded after the new healthcare arrangements were agreed. That is, capped benefits, higher deductibles and copays, and employee contributions to premiums, and a tighter link to Medicare. 8, don't let the states get away with irresponsible behavior, often politically motivated, in the expectation of getting a federal bailout. 9, rethink and simplify the whole income tax structure. Simpson-Bowles is one approach and is an excellent starting point. But the first priority to me is developing a sensible, rational budget regarding spending, and then figuring out how you get there financially without taxing the population into extinction, but with the strong possibility of changing forms of taxation, of VAT, and even, gasp, income tax increases where appropriate. This is a 10-year or longer transition. For states that are solvent but have troubled cities unwilling to take on the challenges for political reasons, which is probably 1 out of every city, set up a municipal assistance corporation, a MAC, or Financial Control Review Board, FCRB, type bodies that take decision-making authority away from the city. A variation on that theme, in the event that city files for bankruptcy, would be for the state to agree to provide debtor in possession, so-called DIP financing, conditional on the city negotiating substantive changes in labor agreements, reducing the workforce where necessary, and selling certain municipal assets to third parties willing to provide the service at lower cost. For example, sewage services, sanitation, water supply, municipal electric utilities, and recreational facilities. It may be possible for the city to sell those existing businesses to a third party for an upfront or staged payment, in addition to entering into new service agreements at lower cost. This brings me to the third step, which is the restructuring, although I think some of my earlier comments on the business plan likewise apply. We were able to reach a compromise with the union of the auto parts company by explaining that unless the benefits were reformed, the company could not raise the capital from new investors needed to emerge from Chapter 11. Under this adverse outcome, the workers would not only lose their retirement health care benefits, but their jobs as well. Only when the realities are made clear is real compromise possible. My unsolicited advice to policymakers, therefore, is to put the facts squarely and transparently before citizens. Policymakers should explain that in the event that no change occurs, we will lack resources to pay for basic vital services, whether national defense at the federal level and police and fire protection at the state and local levels. And when speaking before public workers, policymakers can point to the loss of benefits in the city of Central Falls, Rhode Island. When that city declared bankruptcy last year, a receiver was brought in. He slashed pensions, some by more than half. When the old-line American steel companies like LTV and Bethlehem closed or shrank in bankruptcy, it wasn't entirely due to new competitive mills. Their difficulties were magnified by having 14 retirees for each active worker and carrying multi-$100 million current cash, OPEB, and pension obligations. Tens of thousands of retired workers and their dependents lost health care coverage. The employees of Eastman Kodak may suffer the same fate. As I said earlier about the has-wants fear analysis, if public service employees don't fear a diminution of benefits, they should, given how underfunded most of the plans are. We are in or very close to that situation with respect to our public employees. Nobody wants to see this happen in numerous U.S. cities, states, or even at the federal level. Not the retirees and not the taxpayers who value the services of public workers, whether teachers, firefighters, policemen, or of other civil servants. What is needed today are leaders who are ready to step up and make the tough decisions. True leadership means doing the arithmetic right and disclosing the results transparently, telling citizens to look beyond the narrow self-interest of the present moment and accept the concept of shared sacrifice. This is the key to the successful restructuring of companies, and it must be the linchpin of a strategy to successfully resolve the healthcare, retirement, and excess debt obligations that imperil our governments. This won't be easy or quick, and all the constituencies affected will fight like crazy to protect their turf. As I heard Governor Jeb Bush say recently, good things come from respectful confrontation. Our system needs a giant dose of castor oil. For those too young to know what castor oil is, a reboot. To try and continue on our present course is to invite tragic consequences. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
If you'd be nice enough to state your name. But first, I would love to give a gift to Henry to thank him for those incredibly thoughtful remarks on behalf of the Columbia Business School and the Program for Financial Studies. Yep. Which means we get to smile a little.
Pritpal Kochar, Columbia Business School, 1977. The presentation you made is excellent. What are the chances of it being implemented, even 10% of what you said?
Well, I do believe, although he was a partner of mine at Wasserstein Perella, Rahm Emanuel said, you should never let a good crisis go to waste. I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but on that, we probably will have to go further and see more Central Falls as California before people take this seriously. As someone who's done restructuring, nobody ever enjoys it. Maybe the professionals who get paid as a consequence. I always enjoyed it. But it is difficult, and I don't think anybody really likes to take a step back. I think the key is that everybody has to take a step back. And if there is a shared sacrifice, then it is more palatable. We don't have leaders very often or in very many places who are prepared to stake their personal reputations and their job on telling the truth. And so you don't hear the truth. The truth is, arithmetic doesn't lie. And this is not, you're not talking advanced calculus, you're talking third grade arithmetic. When expenses go up here and revenues are here, that hole is absolutely obvious. And Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan also famously said, we can disagree about our philosophies, but we shouldn't disagree on the facts. The facts are the facts. The facts are often manipulated, but ultimately, when the cupboard is bare, you got to come up with a different solution. And there's the easy way and the hard way. I guess easy is maybe a relative word. Politically, this is an important time. I think we should be conscious of electing leaders who are willing and able to take charge, leading from the front, and to look to make drastic changes in the way we do business. Now, I put the healthcare piece into it as a consequence of a lecture I attended as a trustee of Fordham University, a Fordham alum I'd never heard of, Ronald Del Pino, has become one of the foremost cancer researchers in the country. He's a brilliant guy, and he's now the head of MD Anderson. And he was the one, he just blew me away. We're talking about curing heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and Alzheimer's in 5 to 10 years. 5 to 10 years. And we have an overcrowded world, and needless to say, we're just not prepared for it. We're not prepared for the situation today. So if you add more population and older people who are competent, not just limping around, who want to do things, we just have to rethink it. And that means changing the whole approach to so many things that we do and don't like to change. Why? Because I've been around for a long time. Why the hell should I work another 10 years? Well, that's going to be life in the future. It will have to be. There just isn't enough money. So if you're a public, and I don't mean to single out public sector employees, they have the deal of the year. Private sector people earn half what public sector people earn today. And that excludes benefits. Obviously, that dog don't hunt. It can't go on forever. In Wisconsin, that is what turned the tide. The population did not appreciate that. And when the population discovered that the people who worked for the state and local governments were making twice as much and had benefits that nobody in the private sector could have because they can't afford it, that changed people's thinking. And so you need to start from someplace. It's not fair, but it is going to have to happen. And the issue of fairness is how you deal with everybody who has to take some form of haircut. It's immutable.
Margaret Butler, JD MBA 2001, and member of the board of the private equity program here at the business school. We were speaking a little bit before you started about how the financial services industry and the legal services industry right here in New York probably need to be restructured. And that has been a lot of the financial engine behind New York. So if we take your macro theme and bring it home locally, we do have these expensive MTA contracts and whatnot. And if we think about how we need to restructure private business here, what do you think are some of the implications, and how would you go about making the changes locally?
Well, I think that's a good question. I've been bearish on New York for a long time. I don't pull my punches. Ask my daughter who's sitting up there. The New York has been sustained by a lot of foreign money. Obviously, that only goes so far. I have a hard time understanding how New York is viable. I really do. You can't have $4,000 a month one-bedroom apartments for people who are making $50,000 or $70,000. Doesn't work. It works when daddy pays some of the bills, but that's a limited supply also. When you have, I was disappointed in Mayor Bloomberg's third term. A, that he decided he needed to be the mayor for a third term, and B, that he hasn't done anything on the third term to address the big issues, which was the cost of labor in New York City. Here are some statistics, and you probably have the numbers, maybe, Charlie, more off the top of your head than I do. Guess what? 10,000 families in New York City pay 70% of the personal income taxes in this city. 70%. There are 8 million people and stories in the naked city. What happens when you have most of those people who are the most reliant on public services and people leave? Guess what? People are leaving. That's something that politicians have an enormous degree of difficulty believing. In Maryland, a couple of years ago, there was a tax surcharge. Obviously, the states know from tax returns who makes money. They put a big surcharge on the wealthiest people in Maryland, and a year later, half of those people had left Maryland. Same thing happened in Oregon. Wealth is mobile. Businesses are fleeing California in droves. It's a beautiful place. I think there's no other state in the United States is as beautiful as California or as stupid. So, so you like the weather and you're willing to pay 65 or 70% in effective tax rate. God bless you, not me. So people are moving. Connecticut has lost a lot of its wealth to Florida, Texas, other places where you can have a viable business and not pay rates of taxation that are high. I mean, I thought in not so much these presidential debates, but in the McCain-Obama debates from '08, McCain didn't know anything about these issues, which was disappointing. I would have engaged the audience. Do you make $50,000 or less? Do you make $50,000? What do you think a fair rate of taxation is for high-income earners? Do you know what the research says? Guess what? What do you think the research says? A fair rate of taxation for someone who makes money, 30%. So by definition, most people who are in that category pay more than 30% today, right? The official rate is 35. If you're in private equity, you may pay a lower rate. I don't. I pay full rates. Plus, if you have the honor of living in Manhattan, you pay another 14%. And the way the tax changes are going, there will be flat taxes with no mutual credit, so you'll pay the full cumulative cost. So even without any changes, just by kind of evolution, 36 plus 14 is 50. You have the surcharges from Obamacare at 3.8% on a lot of things. You can easily work yourself up to 60 or 65% here. All 5 Democratic mayoral candidates to succeed Bloomberg have proposed a surtax on the wealthy. And millionaires and billionaires, because the New York City school system is screwed up, and most of these people went to public schools, it starts at $250,000. So you're a millionaire at $250,000, not at $1 million. What do you think that does? So I think on the macro picture, I just have a hard time believing that this doesn't become a crisis. And you got very tough unions in this town. And you had, when the MTA went on strike a couple years ago, only in New York can you have a mediator, after 2 weeks of strike that accomplished nothing, have a mediator who really works for labor. And the reality of the situation did not come into play. They have the standard, well, if the police make this and the firemen make this proportion automatically and the sanitation guys make that percent and the MTA's got to make that percent, so they're entitled to raises and they're entitled to actually, they don't have to give up anything. Come on. But for law firms and banks, I think the die is cast. It's going to be very hard. I shouldn't say this at Columbia Business School. I think it's going to be very hard for law firms to grow the way they have. Clients have figured out that they can negotiate, they can get flat rates. They don't want 22 people to staff a transaction that 3 people can handle. They really want the gray-haired person who's experienced, who can help do the deal and not to pay for a lot of mechanical work that, as you said before, comes off a template and a computer. And investment banks, you tell me, for the universal banks, guys, less leverage, more equity capital, and you can't do the things that make you money, huh? I mean, that can't be a good thing. And living in New York, where you're paying $100 a foot for real estate, if you're JP Morgan, I just have a hard time believing why they want to have X million square feet on Park Avenue. They have to move stuff to less expensive locations. And by the way, we'll all be working from our homes or in remote locations. It isn't as critical to get together anymore. So if you can get that space for $25 a foot in Kansas City or in the South or someplace, it just strikes me as it has to happen. Everybody wants to see change. College, the big issue to me is college and business school. Who can afford $50,000 or $60,000 a year times however many years? And I'm a trustee at my undergraduate school, Fordham University. It's a bargain, generally speaking, but I'm saying 10 years from now, we will not be doing things the same way. You can't. And if you have a brand like Harvard or Columbia, that's going to be different. If you have, there's something like 3,500 colleges and universities in the United States. Let's face it, a degree from lesser schools is not going to mean much. So that, to me, is also something that's going to be big on the restructuring front. And there'll be a lot of pain and a lot of difficulty accepting the reality of evolution. We're laughing in Greenwich. Well, I'm not laughing in Greenwich. All our wires are above ground. Go to Albania, you won't see a wire. It's all underground, which logically is where all this stuff should be. We have a huge infrastructure. We're technologically behind in a lot of places because we're still paying off, or the companies are still paying off, or depreciating for accounting purposes, old stuff. All these things are going to cost us in the long term. I jokingly said if our Indian colleagues went back to India, the United States would collapse. We really have to be mindful. And I don't mean this, I'm a bit of a wise guy, I accept that. But the fact is, I think we are being naive and unrealistic to imagine that we can somehow take a pass on this. It is going to get us. The smart way is to get out front, come up with thoughtful ways of dealing with the crisis, and, to paraphrase the president, spread the sacrifices around, because that's what's going to be needed to create an America that is viable. Assuming that we're going to have growth. Growth, by the way, is the plug number. You can come up with great solutions that don't require pain if you assume we can grow fast. Be nice. Actually, it's not nice. The smart companies and GE, the GEs of the world, going back over years, never waited for problems to reach them. They were always thinking 10 years ahead. Where we are just doesn't work. It doesn't work. So we have to get out in front, transition to a more viable solution for the 21st century and on. Otherwise, we won't be the United States we once were. And again, for the professors in the audience who know more than I, 200 years is kind of a life cycle of democracies. And we're there. Needless to say, we're past our sell-by date. And so we can either adjust or we'll find ourselves in a much less comfortable position than we are today.
I'm Patrick Blott, class of '97, and I just want to pick up on your theme about government encroaching on the private sector, and if you could just share some insight and comments as to how you think the PBGC may or may not become more active, and maybe the evolution of the code and particularly the case law with the bankruptcy judges and how they're viewing the discount rate, and if we really do have a train wreck, how that might play out in terms of whether the bankruptcy court becomes a viable solution to fix what is becoming an increasingly large overhang on a lot of companies that otherwise generate and hoard a lot of cash.
Okay. The PBGC is an interesting entity, Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. It was founded, I think, under ERISA to assure that pensions would be paid to plan members in the event that the company itself was unable to provide the pensions which it had promised. Kind of where to start. Philosophically, what you have are really two different views of what the PBGC does. The Democratic side, and it tends to be counterintuitive, actually. The Democratic thesis is that it's an insurance company and you match assets and liabilities. So when the Democrats have been in office, they've tended to buy long-term fixed income securities and try to match the actuarial payouts that they assumed they would be responsible for with assets. That's actually a pretty responsible approach. The Republican side is no, you fund a portfolio to try to earn a certain return, and you treat it like any other pension scheme. So you put together a broad allocation of all sorts of stuff, the way most institutional managers manage money. And so both can work at the right time, and both don't work at other times. What you have is a PBGC that charges a fee every year to every registered pension plan. And like the FDIC and deposit insurance, it goes into the PBGC. And when a company fails and surrenders its pension plan assets, which is what happened, whatever it has, goes into the PBGC pot, and then they provide pensions to the working population who've just lost their plan. But what they provide is based on a grid, of which I couldn't tell you what the highest number is today, but it's under $50,000 a year. So what happens? Well, when they run low on money, which has happened, I'm not sure where they are today, I must say I haven't looked at it in a while, they increase the fee, just like the FDIC charges on deposits held in banks. They need more money. FINRA charges broker-dealers when they think they're going to have to make a payment. So under MF Global or some of the brokerage firms that failed, Lehman Brothers and so on, where the SIPC has to make payments, these things come out of funds that the members of the industry contribute. So you have a question of how much do you have to pay. So you run a fully funded plan, and yet you're being charged money.
So I guess the bigger issue is whether the PBGC is going to become a proactive actor and make force filings by companies that are basically insolvent if you include the pension plan, but otherwise highly profitable, highly productive companies.
They've never done that. I've never seen that. They tend to be semi-active. And one of the problems, this could be changed with legislation, of course, but one of the problems is that they only have a nuclear option. The only thing they really can do is involuntarily terminate the plan. That causes a lot of pain, But I've never seen them on a prospective basis say they were going to do that. Now, if you miss a payment, then you have a conversation with the PBGC, and that can be less pleasant, but they still don't have a lot of weapons in their arsenal. Now, over the years, legally, they've had their positions somewhat strengthened in terms of the priority of their recovery versus others. And that's been led predominantly by labor, who are the most affected by planned terminations and insolvencies of companies. I don't see them doing that now, but again, it depends on who's in charge and what their overall philosophy is about government involvement and labor's role in society versus a lot of other things. You know, when some class of creditors is favored over another class of creditors, the formerly favored class has to think twice about providing credit, and certainly at the rates that somebody would call competitive. So if I'm a secured lender and I now have a lien primed by a PBGC claim, then that changes completely my decision of how I lend on what basis and whether I lend at all. And you can visualize situations where lots of companies who are mid-sized companies can't get any access to credit because you're putting a huge number ahead of their of third-party financing. The other thing I would say is that when I talked about the assumed discount rate for pension earnings and as well on actuarial assumptions of payout, the PBGC uses something close to the Treasury rate to discount the liability. So if Connecticut was 8.25 and a corporation is 4.5, they may be at 1. So you have the complete reverse where they build the liability to be much higher than would likely be the case in the real world. So you have that dynamic always happens. And if they involuntarily terminate, they argue that the discounted liability is discounted at a Treasury or very low rate. So I think
the question is, are the judges more realistic?
you know, under the normal bankruptcy regime, I think our judges, particularly in the sophisticated jurisdictions in New York, Chicago, Delaware, some of the places in Texas, definitely not in California, and odd places like Lexington, Kentucky, you have sophisticated, smart people who see through what I would call a very parochial view. And oftentimes, because bankruptcy is a court of equity, the judges have a lot of flexibility to guide a solution where there is a more realistic division of benefits than the law may say. I could go into that for hours, but it's the wrong time.
Let's join in thanking him very much.
Thank you.